second episode.
It makes more money.
Thumbs up is crazy though.
Welcome back to Flipping Tables. We're excited to have you guys here. We're your hosts. This is Javi and I'm Fern. We hope you guys are having a great day, a great week, a great everything. Today's topic that we're going to be going through is God listening?
Like Fern said, today we're going to be discussing about is God listening to us and how to identify God's voice. A lot of times we might ask ourselves, is God listening?
Mm-hmm.
Because we're not seeing the answers,
Right.
Or we don't know if he's actually talking to us because we can't identify his voice.
I think that's sometimes in your Christian walk, in your faith, that's one of the biggest questions, right? Like, how come I don't get the answer?
Yeah.
Or what's going on? Is he even there? Like, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing right? How come I don't get the answers that I'm looking for?
Or how can I hear him more frequently?
Yeah.
I only hear him every once in a while, and maybe that's through a prophecy that somebody came to give you, but you're not listening to him on a daily basis or a weekly basis.
Yep. One of the first things that we want to talk about is going to be positioning yourself close to God.
Yeah.
Right. Being able to understand what it means to be at the right place at the right time, type of thing. You hear those comments all the time, and they're very common to use, being at the right place at the right time. But for us as Christians and in our faith, to hear God's voice, it's important to be able to position yourself in the right place to do that.
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind is Samuel and Eli. In 1 Samuel, it says that Samuel set up his bed in the temple.
Yep.
It's all about positioning. So he got close to God.
Yeah.
Right. What does that look like in today's day and age? For the listener that's out there, like, does that mean going to church or falling asleep in church?
Taking a nap.
Yeah, taking a nap during service. What does that really look like, positioning yourself closer to God?
Well, I would say, like, for me, it's really just knowing where God is, right? We've talked before about the sphere of influence, being surrounded by the right people, finding a place. So I would say church attendance would be one, right? Making sure that you're consistently going to church. You know that that's God's house. But more importantly, when you get there, Samuel set his bed right at the temple, So for us, when we walk into church, what's the kind of reverence that we have to go into church?
Mm-hmm.
Do we just show up and warm up a chair? Or is it something that we're really going there with a genuine heart to really seek him and to really seek his voice, That to me is one of the biggest things that I think it's the most important part of it all. What is it that you're actually going to do? And what is it that you're doing there? What is it that you're doing to set yourself apart in order to capture his attention, to make sure that he's speaking to you?
Yeah, I think to jump on that, it's like your reverence to God, right? Like you said, are you just there to warm up a chair, take another seat? Or do you actually understand like what you're there to do or why we're there? And so I think that if you truly understand why you're there, it changes everything.
Yeah.
It changes everything.
So Samuel, had never heard God's voice before.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like he knew his voice,
right?
In the same chapter, right, when it starts to talk about how he heard a voice calling him. At first, he mistaken that voice for Eli's voice. So he kept going to Eli, say, "Hey, what's good? Like, what can I do?" A couple of things stand out to me in that story. For one, it was the middle of the night, but he was serving. In other words, he never stopped serving.
Mm-hmm.
He positioned himself in a place where he was serving and working with or for Eli. But even in the middle of the night, he wasn't clocking out, because if his master called him in the middle of the night, he still stood up and said, "Hey, what can I get you? What'd you need?" Yeah. Eli said, I didn't call you. Comes back a second time. He comes back a second time and says, "What did you need?" And Eli again repeats, "I didn't call you."
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, "Well, I heard this voice." He says, "Well, if he calls you again, make sure that you answer, and basically said, "This is God calling you,"
Mm-hmm.
because it's not me. But again, the number one thing that stands out to me, he put himself in a position where he knew that God's presence was going to be one, and two, when he kept hearing the voice of Eli, he was still willing to serve.
Yeah.
Why? Because he respected his authority figure. He respected Eli and was willing to serve Eli until his time came. And sure enough, when he started being called, he was still willing to serve Eli. It stands out to me that it's the middle of the night. How many of us get up because someone calls us in the middle of the night and starts, to move about and to run some errands for somebody? It doesn't happen a whole lot.
Or you're
But for
not
us to
willing to
do it,
do that for a lot of others.
exactly. So the fact that you have that heart to serve, that's going to set yourself apart. Having the reverence, as we mentioned, that's going to set yourself apart. Having a personal devotion with God when you make your one-on-ones with Him. That's going to be something that has to be the start of everything that's going to be good with your relationship with God and being able to hear His voice.
Yeah. And I mean, I think God will speak to you when you're serving too,
Mhm.
right? Because Jesus came here to serve others, not to be served.
Exactly.
And so, if I think part of that also if is God listening to you, is God using you,
Yeah.
right? I think a lot of times, I mean, just thinking back to, like when I'm serving or just praying for people, God has used me then. So that I think that's part of it too. Serving, I think God will speak to you through your service too. And you will be able to recognize His voice.
I'll tell you this much. Kind of takes us into our second topic, right? Which is to find a place of regular service for God or to God. And when you're teaching, at least for us, one thing that I learned early on, that our pastor taught us, was that when you are preparing yourself for a class, for anything, right? When you're going to speak on it, the word is so good that it speaks to you first. It's a lesson to you 1st
Mhm.
before you can teach it to anybody else. When the word says that we're supposed to be knowledgeable of it, it's not enough to just be able to read something. It's far more important to be wise in the subject, in the sense that in order for you to be wise in something, you have to have the knowledge of it, but you have to have the experience of it. In other words, you have to be living the word
Right.
in order for you to be able to teach it and to teach it freely with nothing holding you back.
Mhm.
So when I'm looking at this and you're talking about put yourself in a place where you're doing things, for God, it's different to be cleaning the kitchen at church, where you're amongst brothers and you're having fellowship and you're speaking word and everything in its life, that is Christ centered, versus you clean your kitchen because it's something you have to check off your list at home.
Right.
Two different things. So I find it that it's important to be able to do that. We talked about reverence before, and something that came to mind is like a courtroom. Like when you go to church and you walk in, are you on your cell phone? Are you texting? Are you scrolling to social media? Are you wearing a hat? Like, what is it that you do? If you walk into a courtroom, you have to have a certain level of reverence for the judge themselves. They're not going to let you walk in there with a hat. They're not going to let you walk in there with your cell phone in your hand. They're not going to let you have a conversation while she's talking. You know what I mean? It's like, but sometimes when you walk into church, you forget to have that reverence. We walk in and we're sitting and we're scrolling through our phone. The preaching can be going on, and no one's paying attention to anything that's going on. So it's really about, putting yourself in that position is one, but where's your heart at? And are you really paying close attention to what needs to be done, what you need to be hearing, Because God can speak to you through the preaching, like you mentioned. He can talk to you through prophecy, but He can also talk to you through your own service. Sometimes He's going to use you to prophesy to someone else, and the word speaks to you right then and there.
Right.
But it is going to be about, if you want to hear the voice of God, you have to be doing godly things. I want to go on to the next part of this is listening to God's voice, right? Going back to the story where Eli was lying in his bed, yeah, right? And in the temple, you have Samuel laying in his. One thing that we have here, this says right here, says he was too preoccupied with his own interests.
Mhm.
He was doing his own thing in his own room, separate from God's room, if that makes any sense. So we could put it to that sense. When God began to speak, in other words, he didn't hear God's voice, but Samuel was listening to it. Samuel's ear was attentive to who's calling and who's not.
Mhm.
What are we doing in our own privacy? What are we doing at home? What are we doing when no one's around? What are we doing that is either bringing us, drawing us closer to God, or it's distracting us and pulling us away from it? Because when you're in your own room and you're doing your own thing, and it's the same building and God's calling out, but only one person hears it, somebody's doing something wrong. Many times to hear what God is saying, we have to slow down and take time to get close to God. We have to put aside our interest and lean into hear what God is saying. So if we're sitting here and we want to hear God's voice, but we're on our phones while someone's talking to us, or while the preaching is going on, while the prophecies are going on, we can speak this from experience, right? When you're in class and you're given a lesson, and you have kids that pull out their cell phone, and you can see that it's evident like they're not paying attention. They're doing their own thing. I personally don't just stop the lesson right off the back and be like, you know what, they're not listening, so nobody gets it. I just keep giving the lesson because at the end of the day, it's like those who are eager to get it, those are who are receptive to what you want to give. They're going to be there. They're going to be taking notes. They're going to be paying attention. They're going to be doing the thing. It could get to the point where the kids themselves will start to distract the others with their phone. To me, that's when I put a stop to them. Like, hey guys, put your phone away. It's one thing that if you're distracted, it's another thing if you're going to start distracting others from it. But going back to this part, right, is we want to be able to hear stuff, but we want to do it in our comfort, in our own comfort, in our own pace when we want it, and not when it's available to us.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is, listening to God's voice. Sometimes we wait or we think God's going to speak in this like loud, thunderous voice, like in the movies, right?
Right.
Or there's going to be lightning when he's talking to you. And, that's not always the case. When personally, when God has spoken to me, it's been like a whisper, almost like a little, like a gentle, like a gentle breeze.
Mm.
And it's just like, so you really have to be listening.
Yeah.
Because God's not going to be yelling at you. God's not going to be like, listen up. God's going to say, hey, this is what I have for you. And this is what it is. These are the steps. And if you're not, listening, if you're talking louder than God, you're going to miss it.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's, active listening, because again, personally, from personal experience, like, the times besides when people have given me prophecy and it's been very like direct, right? It's been like that. It's a gentle whisper, and then you're almost like, all right, did God just speak to me right now?
Yeah.
But with that gentle whisper comes a certain peace, right? And then that sort of solidifies, like, God just spoke to me.
And it's crazy you say that because the way that God speaking to his people was described, and you do find it in when they're coming out of Egypt, and they're heading into the desert, and they get to Mount Sinai, creo que es Monte Sinai, and that's how it's described, that thunderous voice, big old powerful lightning, and the whole works and everything's like to the point where his people were shook, like they were scared, and they all basically came together to say, you know what, Moses, you talk to us, Sometimes it can be intimidating to speak to God or to hear God's voice, right? I feel like sometimes whether we know it consciously or subconsciously, we know that in order to be in touch with God like that, at that level, it takes demand. You know, to whom like more is given, more is demanded of, right? So for us to have the privilege to hear his voice like that, it's going to demand more of you in the sense that you can't live the way that you normally live. You
Mm-hmm.
have to have a certain different lifestyle that changes you. You know, things have to be very different. They can't be the same thing. And a part of it has to be with the way that you carry yourself on a daily basis, how you talk, the words you use, your vocabulary, the tonality, all of these little details that really identifies how you talk. Because in conversation, not to get too technical, right? But in conversation, the words that you choose when I'm talking to you makes a whole difference of how you're going to respond to me, right? You mentioned something about actively listening. Body language means a whole lot,
Yeah.
right? If we're sitting here in this podcast and you're talking to me and I have my whole body turned away from you, I'm like, yeah, yeah, yeah. Like it's and physically, I'm not being receptive. I'm not making eye contact with you. I'm not looking at you, right? It looks bad. You know, Kenny was calling me out on this
Yeah.
podcast. She was like, hey, make sure you're looking at Javi every now and then. Lift your head up. Don't just dive into what's in front of you. Why? Because all those details make a huge difference, right? You have to be able to talk to someone, and we want to be able to talk to God, but are we seeking His face? You know what I'm saying? Like that should be one of the main things that as Christians we should be always seeking His face.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it's one thing to want to talk to Him, one thing to want to hear His voice, and another is, do you want to see Him face to face? And if that's your goal, you know. I remember growing up, I read this poem. I think everybody read in high school back in the day, where it says like, if you if you aim high, like shoot at the moon, you might not get there, but you're gonna land amongst the stars. You know, if I use that concept to my relationship with God, then that means I should be aiming to see His face.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because if I don't get to see His face, at least I'm going to be having conversation with Him. And if I don't get to have this interaction where it's face to face, at least I'm hearing His voice. You know, and if I'm hearing His voice and He's hearing mine, at least we're conversating. And if we're conversating, at least I'm going to get Him to hear whether it's my prayers, my petitions,
Yeah.
or even if it's just venting to get something off my shoulders, you know, to lay things at His feet. But I know He's listening to me.
Yeah.
There's levels to this, you know, and you have to want to get to the highest level, which is to see His face.
Yeah. I think one thing that you just touched on, and I kind of experienced this maybe like 2 years ago. Um, and I shared this with some people. I was like, I used to have these, I used to make these prayers when I was little, as a 6, 7 year old kid, right?
Yeah.
When, I was still dreaming of like what I was going to become and this and that, right? And I used to have these prayers. And then, like 2 years ago, I realized something. I'm like, man, like I'm living, some of the things that I prayed for already,
Yeah.
whether I noticed it or not. So I think, part of that is also like, is like listening to God's voice, because I felt that God was like, you remember those, prayers you were making as a 5 year old, as a 6 year old, that were like super like big and unrealistic maybe, right? And now you're like, you have the opportunity to live those dreams, or I've opened the doors for you to, be able to do certain things. And I'm like, man, God was really listening to a 6 year old, a seven
Yeah.
year old. So I think knowing that and having the faith to say that God hears me.
Yep.
God hears me. It doesn't matter how old I am. Doesn't matter where I am. Because we've all done it where we've prayed laying down in bed, ready to go to bed, or we've prayed, in the shower. We've
Yeah.
prayed while cooking. We've prayed while driving. Running out of the house. But God is still listening. God is listening to those cries. God is listening to those prayers.
Yeah.
So But I think it takes a little bit of sometimes reflecting and being like, okay, God, dang, I am living that.
And it's good that you said that, because sometimes we assume that because we don't get an answer immediately, that he's not listening,
Yeah.
right? And sometimes it's going to be in God's time. The scriptures teaches us that God's time is always perfect. Somehow we feel that if we didn't get the answer that we were looking for,
Yeah.
he didn't hear me out. He's not paying attention to me. And just because God doesn't say yes immediately, it doesn't mean that it's a no. You probably heard that a lot. People have heard that a lot, right? It's a very common thing where it might be a no now. It doesn't mean it's a no forever. It could be wrong timing or whatever.
Yeah, not right now.
Yeah, and not right now, But again, sometimes we don't hear the no. We don't hear the not now. We don't hear anything, and sometimes we just tend to assume that he wasn't paying attention. So I think sometimes it's important to understand that God's going to give you an answer. It takes patience,
Right.
and sometimes it takes a little bit of consistency, being persistent. I have 4 kids, different ages. When they want something, and I see it, the older they get, the more less persistent they are. Hey, can I get this? No, I can't do that. No, you can't do it. So they'll turn and they'll do their thing, But the little ones, hey, can I go play videos? No, I told you 2 hours. You hit your max and done. 30 minutes later, is it okay if I use your iPad? I was like, no, I just told you like you can't do it. Can I play my Switch? Like, no, my guy, like it's you already asked, And maybe 1-2 days I'll say no for like all day long. But every now and then I'm like, all right, 1 more hour and then that's it.
Mm-hmm.
On the weekends, all right, you can go play because it's the weekend. You know what I'm saying? But that persistence, and then all of a sudden the older ones are like, oh, you're so soft with them. You were just as persistent.
You just asked once.
Yeah, you asked one time and you didn't get what you wanted,
Yeah.
and then you went to go get in the fetus position in your bed. I don't know what they do in their bedroom. But the point I'm trying to make is like when they were little, they were persistent and they would ask, and guess what? They would get it too. You know what I'm saying? So it's like it's just a matter of sometimes we lose patience, because we don't get the answer we want. We don't get the job we wanted. We didn't get the promotion we wanted because we're not getting the grades we want, because we're not getting the opportunities that we want. Like all of a sudden it's like, oh, he doesn't listen to me. Like, what am I doing? Am I wasting my time? Like, what is going on? I pray 2-3 times a week, but it's sometimes it's like going back to it, right? Like, do you come just to ask for something, or do you have a daily devotion?
Mm-hmm.
Because if, like an older kid, and I like my older kids, right? If they come to me once a week asking for something that I just may not think it's good for them, or maybe I just can't, or maybe I don't think that they should, maybe I don't think they're mature enough, and I say no, oh, my dad is always a no with my dad. And it's like, maybe you talk to me every single week and I knew all your plans and I knew what you wanted to
Mm-hmm.
do. And then we had conversations and then you knew what I wanted you to do or what I'm expecting for you, what I want for you in the future. We would see eye to eye a little bit more often. You want to say you wanted to go do something, it wouldn't be can I go shopping? Can I go spend my check? Can I go hang out with my friends? If I know what the whole plan is, then I'm gonna be like, yeah, you know what? I'll drop you off at this time. I'll pick you up at this time, and then I'll pick you up tomorrow. You can actually have that conversation. It might sound weird, right? But the truth of the matter is that the more you converse with someone, the more you're in communication with them, the easier it is for them to work around your schedule.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, as parents, I'm the only parent here, right? So I can speak from experience. Sometimes it's not because I don't want to allow my kids to do something. It may not be because it's bad or it's good or whatever. It might just be because it's an inconvenience. Maybe I don't have the time to go drop off my boy a 45-minute drive because I got to be somewhere else in 15 minutes, And then I won't have the time to go pick them up exactly when it's over at 6 p.m. because I got to be at church somewhere, So sometimes it's just the inconvenience or things not linking up.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to tell me a week ahead, hey, you know what? There's a party a week ahead. Guess what? Now I can work my way around it's just hard when you say, hey, Dad, can I go out right now? And it's like, I got 1,000 things going on right now. You know what I mean? So communication is going to be key, but consistency is the bigger key of it all.
I think that also leads into like when God finally calls you, how do we respond, right? If you see when God was calling Samuel, he got up every time.
Yeah.
And even though Eli was like, I'm not the one calling you, the next time God called him again, he would get back up.
Yeah.
You know, you're talking about willingness to serve, but also your willingness or your eagerness to respond. You know, like you were just giving the example about your kids. If you called out to one of your kids, let's say the older ones, they might not come as quick
Yeah.
as the little ones. Because the little ones are like, oh, maybe he's calling me back about the thing I just asked him for.
Yeah.
Right. And they're like, hey, are you calling me because you're going to let me play an extra hour? Or like,
What,
you
did
know,
you change your mind? Is
yeah,
it a
did you
yes all
change
of a
your
sudden?
mind? You know, the other ones are like, oh, what does he want?
Yeah.
You know? So I think that goes into a lot, you know, how we respond to God. If someone's talking to you and, you know, you're talking about our middle school class, if I ask them a question and they all stare at me and don't respond, I'm going to take it like, hey, like I'm talking to a brick wall here.
Yeah.
Nobody's listening to me. Nobody's engaged with me.
Yep.
Right. So the way we respond to God is also letting him know, you know, how eager um, or how attentive we are to his response.
I like what you say. You know, it's how receptive you're being as a student, right? When we see a kid that's receptive and that they're engaged and they're really like taking in what we're giving, it motivates us to give more.
Yeah.
To pour more into them. Why? Because you can see that they're like sponges; they're absorbing everything in. You know, but when you see like you said, you're talking to a brick wall, it's almost like this might be a complete waste of my energy. You know, like I might just want to save my breath here. You know, obviously you still want to be obedient. We're still there to fulfill a purpose. You know, and don't want to get off topic, but the point that I'm trying to make is that when you're receptive, it makes the person want to give more into you. And the easiest way to stop God from speaking to you is by disobeying Him. You know, the moment that you start doing the complete opposite of what He's asking you to do, He's going to stop asking you to do anything. You know, I get this a lot from my boys. And Danny, if you're watching this, it doesn't mean you can stop doing it, right? But I get into them a lot about, feeding my dog.
Mm-hmm.
The way that I want him to feed, because I'm very picky about raw feeding my dog. Everyone who knows my dog, she's a big old 80-pound Roddy, but I'm very specific on how I want her whole bowl laid out when it comes to her food and everything, There's times when I watch the bowl and it's just like, that's not how I told you to do it, All the ingredients are in there, but it's not laid out the way I wanted you. I can tell you didn't do it the way I told you. I can tell it's not the same amount that I told you to, So gets to the point where I continue to say stuff like to him, and I've had conversations with like, my God, if you can't do that, you can't do it well. Why would I give you more responsibilities? Other opportunities. It gets to a point, and that's just like throwing my boy under the bus now. Sorry about that, but it just is an example of how like sometimes we want more. We want more, and we start demanding more, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, having higher expectations of everything that we want, but we're not giving it everything we have. And what scripture says, if you're faithful in the few, I'll set you as Lord amongst many. But nobody wants to be faithful in the little. You know what I'm saying? And that's sometimes the biggest things, We want to say, God, speak to me, and I want your voice to be like right here. I want to feel your voice. I want the sound to just be so loud that I cannot mistake in your voice. Which sometimes something that you said right now was, sometimes you're going to hear it as a little whisper.
Yeah.
And they may not hear it, the whisper that they're looking for. Maybe the whisper wasn't convincing enough. They want something to be really loud, and because you're over there sitting, being picky about what you should hear.
Yeah.
Now you're not even following instructions. Now you're not being obedient. And when it shuts off, you're like, oh, well, it was never there. Sometimes it's just us. Sometimes it's just us not doing what we're supposed to be doing.
I think you touched on obedience, and that's big too, because I think if we hear, if God talks to us and we're like, okay, God just talked to me, but it's not what we wanted to hear,
Yeah.
a lot of times you're not going to want to obey it.
Yeah.
Because God is probably telling you, for the most part, what you didn't want to hear anyway, right?
Yeah.
You're like, please, for example, please let it be this girl. Let it be her. You date her, and God's like, that's not the one for you. But you're like, come on, God, like, you can make it work. And then you end up getting hurt.
Yeah.
And God's like, I told you it wasn't her, But you're like, all right, now you're hurt. You're like, oh, okay. But if you would have just obeyed, you would have never gotten hurt.
Exactly.
So obedience goes a long way. And we can see it in the Bible too when, Moses hit the rock.
Yeah.
It wasn't the right response.
Yep.
It wasn't the right attitude. And that caused them to lose his opportunity to go into the promised land.
Yep.
He did all that. He saw all of God's miracles. God was speaking to him, giving the orders to him. And because he didn't respond the right way, or he wasn't obedient in the way he did things, it cost him that chance to get into the promised land.
And part of that is going to be about being detail oriented, being able to listen. Pastor, I think I heard Pastor say this a couple of times, where he says, we have 2 ears and one mouth,
Right.
And that means you're supposed to be able to listen twice as much as you talk. So when God's talking to you, you have to be able to pay attention, listen to detail of the instructions, and then be obedient and follow it. Not just do what you like or do the parts that you liked. Not just go in there and do what you think is convenient, but do everything. And you give the example of Moses smacking a rock, right?
Yeah.
The truth of the matter is there's nothing that said, hey, go hit the rock. And that caused consequences that he saw later on.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we don't want to follow the instructions because it's not what we want to do. And sometimes it's just because we don't know enough of what we want to do. And this is kind of takes us to our next point, where reading and studying the Word of God is very important, because it's not enough to just have good intentions. It's not enough to just know what's good and what's wrong. It's not enough to say, okay, well, God's asking me to do this. I'm going to go, swing in the dark and just take shots, and see if it works. It's not like that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you're going to be told to do something, and maybe you don't get further instructions. I'll tell you why you didn't get further instructions, because the instructions are in Scripture. And if you took the time to just go back and read Scripture, you would know. Just saying that brings to memory the story of David, when they're moving van a mover el
tabernacle,
el pacto,
the ark,
the covenant, yeah. And they're moving the ark, and they put it on a cart being pulled by, I believe it was oxen or something like that. Some sort of animals pulling it. It hits a pothole, and the whole thing starts to tilt over. And I think it was Asa that reaches out and holds it up because he wanted to tilt over, and he struck dead right then and there.
Mm-hmm.
It says that he left it. They left it there. Ended up going to homeboy's house. He finds out that he's being prosperous because of that, and he says, "Well, you know what? We need to bring that back home."
To Obed.
So what he does, yeah, and then what he does is it says that he went to Scripture and read and realized, oh snap, we're not supposed to be pulling on a cart. It's supposed to be carried, So sometimes the answer is already in the Scripture, and we're not going about doing our due diligence of reading Scripture, of being knowledgeable. And the Lord wants to give us the wisdom to do things, but part of it is going to be experience, and part of it's going to be just knowing Scripture, and sometimes that's really where it's at, the lack of knowledge that we have.
I think also, God may give you that first step, right? That initial plan, or, but he also wants to see where your faith is at.
Facts.
And so he might not tell you the whole plan, right? I heard this, and it was about the story of Joseph. And it was like, God might show you the plan and the vision, but he's not going to show you how you're going to get there. Because if he was to, show Joseph everything that he was going to go through, Joseph would have said, yeah, I'm good on that.
Yeah, I don't know what all
that's
that.
not for me, And so because he didn't know, I mean, he just saw the ultimate, right? The end goal, end result. Even though he went through everything, he still trusted God.
Right.
So I think a lot of times God's just waiting for us to take that first step, and he's gonna say, okay, you listened, you obeyed,
Yeah.
you responded to me. Now here's the next instruction. And then we're just gonna have to keep following him faithfully.
Right.
And that also reminds me, like my brother, he's a teacher, and he was like, when I teach the kids something and they're not paying attention, but I taught them. Then they come back, hey, can you teach me again? Hey, what was this? How do I do this? He's like, hey, like I taught you already. Sometimes it's, hey, figure it out. Or you have a notebook,
text,
right? You have your textbook, like go open it. It's going to read it. And it's going to show you. It's like what you said, right? It's in the book already. Yeah. It's in the book. We have all these examples, they can be very old, but they still apply to today and,
exactly.
Today and life. And it's like, the answer is right there.
The biggest thing I would say is like, when we talk about, is God talking, or is God talking to us? Is he listening to us? I want to say that the bigger question is, are we listening to him? Are we willing to listen to him? Are we willing to obey? Are we willing to lead a different lifestyle to be able to speak to us? You know what I'm saying? Like, I'll tell you this much, like, there's certain things that you can't do when you're trying to conversate with someone. Let's hit up the obvious ones, right? If you're talking to a girl, and obviously a girl, you like her and everything, you're like, okay, I'm trying to get close to her. You can't show up to her without showering, looking dirty, all smelly, not brushing your grill. Mm-hmm. Like you just can't do that, right? You're gonna show up what? Fresh haircut, showered, looking smelling good, like the whole works. You're gonna do everything it takes to impress, right? Spiritually speaking, if you're the kind of person who comes to his presence once a week, hoping that he's gonna listen to you, but yet you're coming filthy, spiritually speaking, right? You lead a life of sin Monday through Friday, Saturday, and then Sunday you want to come in and hoping that he's gonna be like, oh yeah, come over here, sit right here. Let's have a really close encounter. This close, we're gonna be able to, but you smell. Your lips is crusty, your breath is kicking.
You got the eye boogers.
Yeah. You got eye bags, the eye boogers. You have the whole eye works. You know what I'm saying? Like you're not appealing both by smell or by sight, right? Nobody wants to be around that. Let's call it what it is. Even if it's not a relationship where it's a girl and a guy, what if it's just one of my sons? What if it's my boys? Like they go out and they play and they come inside, they're all sweaty and muddy and everything. My guy, you can't sit in my couch with muddy shoes and all that. Take off your shoes, go take a shower, and when you're clean, come by us. You know what I'm saying? Like other than that, we're not trying to smell all that. It's crazy to take it there, but in the spiritual sense, it has to be the same thing. The closest thing to holiness is going to be cleanliness, and you can't just show up all filthy, all dirty, thinking that, oh, I'm just gonna walk straight into his presence and he's gonna love me, he's gonna accept me for who I am, because there's a difference between mercy and tolerance. Two different things, and sometimes that's the most important thing that I feel like sometimes we tend to leave out. We're trying to sugarcoat things. God's not tolerant of your sin. He's merciful and he loves you, but he's not tolerant of everything that you do, which is two different things. So when it comes to this, it's like the question is not, is God listening? The question should be, are we listening? Are we receptive? Are we letting them know that we really want this? We want this relationship. We want more of him, because that's really where I think he is all about.
Yeah, I think to like just reinforce that, a lot of times, and this is something that I kind of recently learned and started noticing about myself, is like, I'm asking God for this and I'm praying and I'm like, God, give me this, or God, show me this, reveal this to me. but I'm not leaving any space or any time for him to talk back.
Yeah.
And a few episodes ago, I gave you that example about God's always talking,
Yeah.
right? And it's about our position. But, if we're doing too much or we're too busy and we're not letting God speak to us, like you were just saying, we're not creating that space or that time for him to just say, okay, God, this is your time. I'm listening. I'm all ears right now.
Yeah.
What do you want me to do? And we're all busy. I get it. You might be in school or you might have a job, whatever your case is. But honestly, for me, sometimes it's been in my car where, after I finish praying, okay, God, like I'm just, I'm driving, but I'm actively listening. I'm paying attention to what I'm doing, but I'm not letting my mind drift off as like, dang, where should I stop to eat?
Yeah.
Or what is so and so doing? Let me jump on social media, or I'm taking those 3 4 5 minutes to say, all right, God, and sometimes again it's a gentle whisper. God uses that. Boom, that's okay, God, like that's what I needed to hear. So I think allowing God to speak to us. You talked about listening. Are we listening? Yeah. And I think that's key too, because if we're doing all the talking, you're not letting God get his say, or God speaking right back, but we're talking louder than him. If we're both talking at the same time, you're not gonna get what I'm trying to tell you. I'm not gonna get what you're trying to tell me.
Yeah.
Because I'm too busy worrying about what I gotta say.
I mean, I've seen it a lot, right? Where sometimes you're telling someone, hey, this right here is wrong, and this, and you did this, and you did that, and before you can even get however you're doing this part, before you can get the whole statement out, no, but so and so did that, and like, they start defending themselves to the point where they stop listening. They shut you out. Like, you can't. It's pointless to keep talking because nothing that you say is going to get through to them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, um, and it kind of goes back to what I said earlier, right? Where communication is a big part of it. We have to know that there's value in the message that you have. There's value in the person that you're speaking to, but the way that you're conveying the message as well is also very important. Communication is going to be key. And when it comes to it, your relationship with God, if you value it like that, you're going to learn to value all these things.
Yeah.
Why? Because you have to have the right vocabulary to speak to God. You can't just come to God thinking that you're going to talk to him the way that you talk to everyone else and that everything is normal and you're going to get the results you're looking for. You also can't just approach him like you would hit up any one of your friends and be like, hey, what's up? What you up to?
Mm-hmm.
You want to hang out next week? It's not going to work like that with God.
Work.
So it's like there's certain limitations and things that you have to do differently. And you have to start on a daily basis. Consistency, clarity, like you said, giving him time to respond, knowing that it's not just you in the room. He's there. Yeah. He's listening. And you have to really plan for that as well.
I think the last thing I want to sort of leave is, and only because my last class, a kid came up to me, he asked me, he mentioned, he was like, how do I know God is talking to me? Because he was like, I had, a dream and I had it 3 consecutive times. And I was like, oh, okay. That could be a sign, right?
Yeah.
But then he was like, but they weren't really like good dreams. They were nightmares. And, I haven't really like dove into that, but I heard preaching, and the pastor, and sort of what I mentioned earlier was, I think when God speaks to you, there's a certain peace that comes along with it. It's a light that he brings. I don't think God's going to talk to you with nightmares.
Yeah.
If it's a nightmare, I don't think that's from God, even if it is a constant thing. So I think identifying God's voice, and that comes with knowing him, right? Your kids know you, so you can talk to them in a room of 100 people, they'll recognize your voice.
Exactly.
So you have to be able to identify God's voice, but by doing that, you have to place yourself in the right position. You have to serve, you have to listen for it.
Yeah.
And, we touched on all those things, respond eagerly, obey him when he speaks, and obviously read and study the word.
Right. And just like you said, God doesn't give us a spirit of fear. If anything, He wants us to be courageous. He wants us to go out there, go be go getters, and make things happen. So thank you guys for tuning in this week. We pray that this message is blessing you as much as it blesses us. If you guys want to share it with a friend or family member, we encourage you to do so.
So please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys next week.